The evening had started like any other at the suburban family clinic in Santa Rosa, California. Dr. Alistair Finch was finishing up his paperwork, ready to close for the night when his last appointment walked through the door. A teenage girl and her father. But something was immediately wrong. The father, Greg, kept his hand firmly on his 14-year-old daughter Rory's shoulder, guiding her movements like a puppet master controlling strings. The girl wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. She clutched her stomach and stayed silent while her father answered every question for her. When the nurse tried to take Rory's vitals, Greg insisted on staying close, speaking over his daughter whenever she tried to open her mouth. The atmosphere in the examination room grew thick with an unspoken tension that made Dr. Finch's skin crawl. What he was about to discover on that ultrasound screen would force him to make the most difficult decision of his medical career. Dr. Finch had been practicing medicine for over 20 years. He'd seen countless patients walk through his doors with various ailments and concerns. But tonight felt different from the moment Greg and Rory entered his clinic. The man was in his early 40s, stocky build, wearing a blue polo shirt that seemed too tight around his shoulders. He spoke with an authoritative tone that brooked no argument. Rory, on the other hand, was a ghost of a girl. She wore a red hoodie that seemed to swallow her small frame. Her blonde hair hung limply around her face, creating a curtain that hid her expressions. She moved carefully as if every step caused her pain. Sarah, the clinic's nurse, had been the first to notice something was amiss. She'd tried to follow standard protocol, asking Rory directly about her symptoms and medical history. But Greg had interrupted every time, answering for his daughter with increasing irritation. He claimed Rory was just shy, that she didn't like talking to strangers, but Sarah had worked with teenagers for 15 years. She knew the difference between shyness and fear. The way Rory flinched when her father's hand moved, the way she kept her arms wrapped protectively around her midsection. These weren't signs of introversion. They were signs of something much darker. When Sarah reported her concerns to Dr. Finch, he'd initially tried to rationalize the behavior. Some parents were overprotective, especially with teenage daughters. Some families had different dynamics that might seem unusual to outsiders. But as he entered the examination room and saw the pair for himself, his professional instincts kicked into high gear. The air between father and daughter was charged with a toxic energy. Greg sat too close to the examination table, his eyes never leaving Rory. The girl sat hunched over, her breathing shallow and rapid. Dr. Finch began his examination with routine questions, directing them specifically at Rory. Each time Greg would answer before his daughter could even process the question. When the doctor gently but firmly insisted he needed to hear from Rory directly, Greg's jaw tightened. He claimed his daughter had anxiety issues, that she'd asked him to speak for her, but Rory hadn't asked anything. She hadn't said a single word since entering the clinic. The symptoms Greg described were concerning enough on their own. Severe abdominal pain that had been getting progressively worse over several weeks. Nausea and vomiting, especially in the mornings. Fatigue so severe that Rory could barely get out of bed some days. Weight gain despite a loss of appetite. Any experienced physician would recognize these symptoms immediately. Dr. Finch suspected pregnancy, but the way Greg danced around the subject, the way he refused to let Rory speak, suggested something far more sinister than a typical teenage pregnancy. When Dr. Finch announced he needed to perform an ultrasound, Greg's entire demeanor shifted. He became agitated, insisting it wasn't necessary, that they could just get some pain medication and leave. But the doctor held firm. Given Rory's symptoms, an ultrasound was not just recommended, it was essential. Greg finally relented, but he pulled his chair even closer to the examination table, his presence looming over his daughter like a dark cloud. Sarah helped Rory onto the examination table, noting how the girl winced with every movement. When asked to lift her shirt to expose her abdomen, Rory's hands shook so badly she could barely grip the fabric. Sarah gently assisted her, all while maintaining a calm, reassuring presence. But nothing could ease the palpable fear radiating from the teenager. Dr. Finch applied the cool gel to Rory's abdomen, watching as she flinched at the contact. He began moving the transducer across her belly, his eyes focused on the monitor. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The image on the screen confirmed his suspicions. Rory was pregnant, but it was worse than he'd imagined. The measurements indicated she was approximately 16 weeks along. 16 weeks. This 14-year-old girl had been carrying this secret for 4 months. But the pregnancy itself wasn't what caused Dr. Finch to panic. As he continued the examination, he noticed serious abnormalities. The fetus showed signs of intrauterine growth restriction. It wasn't developing properly. The heartbeat was irregular, fluctuating between too fast and dangerously slow. These were signs of severe fetal distress that required immediate medical intervention. Without proper treatment, both Rory and the baby were in danger. The doctor's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing while maintaining his professional composure. He couldn't alert Greg to his suspicions, not when the man was clearly the source of Rory's terror. But he also couldn't ignore the medical emergency unfolding before him. He needed to get Rory away from her father, even if just for a few minutes, to understand what was really happening. Dr. Finch made a quick decision. He told Greg that he needed to prescribe prenatal vitamins immediately, emphasizing that the pharmacy next door would close soon. He suggested Greg go fill the prescription while Sarah cleaned up Rory after the ultrasound. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was all he had. Greg hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his daughter alone, but faced with the doctor's medical authority and the ticking clock of the pharmacy's closing time, he finally stood up. The moment Greg left the room, the atmosphere changed completely. Rory's rigid posture softened slightly, though fear still dominated her features. Dr. Finch knelt beside the examination table, speaking in a gentle, non-threatening voice. He told Rory that he was there to help, that she was safe in his clinic. Sarah stood nearby, offering silent support. For a long moment, Rory said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet it was barely audible, she whispered words that would haunt Dr. Finch forever. "The baby always kicks when he reads to me at night. I hate that it likes his voice." The implications of that statement hit both medical professionals like a physical blow. There was no boyfriend. There was no teenage romance gone wrong. There was only a father and the unspeakable things he had done to his own daughter. Sarah had to excuse herself, fighting back tears and rage in equal measure. Dr. Finch remained steady, though inside he was screaming. He asked Rory if she wanted help, if she wanted to get away from her father. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but before she could answer, they heard Greg's heavy footsteps approaching. The moment was lost. Greg returned with the vitamins, his suspicious eyes scanning the room, as if he could sense something had changed. Dr. Finch tried to convince him to take Rory to the hospital immediately, explaining the serious medical risks to both mother and baby. But Greg dismissed the concerns, claiming they would go first thing in the morning. He practically dragged Rory from the clinic, his grip on her arm tight enough to leave marks. Dr. Finch stood in his empty clinic, shaking with a combination of rage and helplessness. He'd taken an oath to do no harm, but sending that girl home with her abuser felt like the greatest harm he could imagine. He couldn't let it end there. He wouldn't let it end there. After closing the clinic, Dr. Finch drove home, but he couldn't stop thinking about Rory. As he passed their house, Greg had mentioned they lived nearby during small talk. He noticed their car in the driveway. They hadn't gone to the hospital. Of course they hadn't. Greg had no intention of seeking medical help that might expose his crimes. The doctor sat in his car for a long moment, wrestling with his conscience. Getting involved beyond his medical duties could have professional consequences. But the image of Rory's terrified face, the memory of her whispered confession, wouldn't let him drive away. He thought about his own daughter, grown now and living across the country. If she had been in Rory's position, he would want someone to fight for her. Dr. Finch made another decision, perhaps the most important of his career. He returned to their house under the pretense of delivering a hospital referral form he claimed they'd forgotten. Greg answered the door, his face darkening when he saw the doctor. He tried to prevent Dr. Finch from entering, but the doctor insisted he needed to check on Rory one more time, that it was his medical responsibility. The house was sparse, almost sterile in its emptiness. No family photos adorned the walls, no signs of a teenage girl's presence, no school books, no personal items, nothing that suggested Rory had any life beyond these walls. It was a prison, disguised as a home. Greg grew increasingly agitated as Dr. Finch insisted on seeing Rory. The girl appeared in the hallway, looking even more fragile than she had in the clinic. While Greg was distracted by his own anger, ranting about privacy and boundaries, Rory did something incredibly brave. She pressed a folded piece of paper into Dr. Finch's hand, her eyes pleading with him to understand, to help, to save her from this nightmare. Dr. Finch palmed the paper, keeping his expression neutral. He told Greg once more about the urgent need for hospital care, then left when it became clear the man would become violent if he stayed any longer. He walked calmly to his car, every instinct screaming at him to run back and physically remove Rory from that house. But he knew that would only make things worse. He needed to be smart about this. Once in his car, safely away from Greg's view. Doctor. Finch unfolded the paper Rory had given him. His hands shook as he saw what she had drawn. It was a child's drawing, simple but devastating in its clarity. A small figure, clearly meant to be a young girl, cowering in a dark room. Above her loomed a massive, monstrous figure with reaching hands. The artistic skill was basic, but the emotion behind it was crystal clear. This was Rory's reality, drawn in crayon and desperation. But it was what was written on the back that made Dr. Finch's decision for him. In shaky handwriting, as if written in a hurry or in the dark, were the words that confirmed everything. He is the father. The baby is his. Please help me. Dr. Finch didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice was steady as he reported the situation to the dispatcher. A 14-year-old girl, pregnant by her father, in immediate danger. Medical emergency requiring immediate intervention, child abuse and endangerment. He gave them the address, his name, his medical credentials. He made it clear this wasn't a suspicion. This was a confirmed case requiring immediate action. The dispatcher took the information seriously. Within minutes, Dr. Finch could hear sirens in the distance. He drove back to the house, parking where he could see but not interfere with police operations. He watched as multiple patrol cars arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness of the suburban street. Officers approached the house strategically, covering all exits. The confrontation that followed was tense. Greg tried to deny the officers' entry, claiming they had no right, no warrant. But the police had probable cause, a mandated reporter's statement about a child in immediate danger. When Greg continued to resist, they forced entry. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the neighborhood as curious residents began emerging from their homes. What happened next was like something from a nightmare. Greg, realizing his crimes were about to be exposed, made a desperate move. He grabbed Rory and ran to the upper floor of the house. Officers gave chase, but Greg was faster, fueled by the desperation of a cornered predator. He burst through an attic window, dragging Rory onto the roof. The scene that unfolded was every emergency responder's worst nightmare. Greg stood on the slanted roof, holding Rory by the wrist as she struggled to maintain her balance. He screamed at the officers below, threatening to jump and take his daughter with him if they came any closer. He ranted about family, about rights, about how no one understood their special relationship. Each word was another nail in the coffin of his guilt. Rory was crying, her free hand protectively covering her pregnant belly. She begged her father to let her go, pleaded with the officers to help her. Her terror was palpable, reaching everyone who witnessed the scene. Dr. Finch had to be physically restrained from trying to climb up himself. The police worked quickly to set up an inflatable landing pad below, while negotiators tried to talk Greg down. They assured him that everything could be worked out, that no one needed to get hurt. But Greg was beyond reason. Years of getting away with his crimes had convinced him he was untouchable. Now, faced with exposure, he was willing to destroy everything rather than face justice. It was Rory who ended the standoff. In a moment of incredible courage, she twisted her body and bit her father's hand as hard as she could. Greg released her in shock and pain. Rory fell, but landed safely on the inflatable pad below. Officers immediately surrounded her, protecting her, getting her to safety. Greg, seeing his control shattered, tried to flee back through the attic window, but officers were waiting. He was tackled, subdued, and arrested. As they led him away in handcuffs, he screamed obscenities, blamed everyone but himself, claimed Rory had seduced him. His words only further confirmed his guilt. Dr. Finch rode with Rory in the ambulance to the hospital. She was in shock, her body shaking uncontrollably, but she was alive. She was free. The medical team at the hospital worked to stabilize both her and the baby. The irregular heartbeat was addressed with medication. The growth restriction would require careful monitoring and intervention, but there was hope. In the following hours, as Rory was treated and made comfortable, the full scope of Greg's crimes began to emerge. Police searching the house found a hidden room in the basement, equipped with locks that could only be opened from the outside. They found cameras, recordings, photographs documenting years of abuse. The evidence was overwhelming and sickening. They also discovered that Rory's mother had been trying to regain custody for years. Greg had used his position, his clean record, and his manipulative skills to paint her as an unfit parent. He had isolated Rory completely, pulling her out of school under the guise of homeschooling, cutting off all contact with extended family and friends. Rory had been a prisoner in her own home for 3 years. As news of the arrest spread, More information came to light. Greg had done this before. There were other victims, other girls he had groomed and abused over the years. Some came forward, emboldened by Rory's escape. The case against him grew stronger with each passing hour. The district attorney, reviewing the mountain of evidence, made it clear that Greg would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The crimes he had committed, repeated sexual assault of a minor, incest, child endangerment, false imprisonment, and more, would result in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Greg would never walk free again. He would die in prison, where even hardened criminals have no tolerance for those who hurt children. But for Rory, the legal resolution was only the beginning of a long journey. She was reunited with her mother, who had never stopped fighting for her. The reunion was emotional, filled with tears and apologies and promises that she would never be alone again. Her mother had prepared for this day, hoping against hope that she would get her daughter back. She had a room ready, therapists lined up, a support system in place. The question of the pregnancy weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Rory was only 14, pregnant with a baby, conceived through the most traumatic circumstances imaginable. The medical team presented her with all her options, including termination. It would be completely understandable, even expected, for her to want to end the pregnancy. No one would judge her for that choice. But Rory surprised everyone with her decision. After days of counseling, of crying, of working through the trauma with therapists and her mother, she made a choice that was entirely her own. She decided to continue the pregnancy. It wasn't a simple decision or one made lightly. She understood the challenges ahead, the daily reminder of her trauma that the pregnancy represented. Her reasoning was profound for someone so young. She explained that the baby was innocent, just as she had been innocent. The baby didn't choose its father, any more than she had chosen what happened to her. She saw the child as another victim of Greg's evil, one who deserved a chance at life and love. She wanted to give this baby everything that had been taken from her: safety, love, a real family. It was also, she explained, about reclaiming her agency. For years, Greg had made every decision for her. He had controlled every aspect of her life. This was her first real choice, the first decision that was entirely hers. Choosing to keep the baby wasn't about Greg or about what anyone else thought she should do. It was about her deciding her own path forward. The medical team rallied around her decision. They put together a comprehensive care plan to address the growth restriction and heart problems. They arranged for specialized counseling to help her process the trauma while pregnant. They connected her with support groups for young mothers, for abuse survivors, for those dealing with the unique challenges she faced. Her mother stood by her completely. She made it clear that whatever Rory decided, she would support her. If she wanted to keep the baby, they would raise it together. If she wanted to place it for adoption, she would help her through that process. If she changed her mind and wanted to terminate, she would hold her hand through that too. For the first time in years, Rory had someone who put her needs and desires first. As the weeks passed, Rory's physical health improved dramatically. With proper nutrition, medical care, and freedom from constant fear, her body began to heal. The baby's heart rhythm stabilized with medication. The growth restriction, while still present, was carefully managed. Regular ultrasounds showed improvement, though the baby would likely be born small and might need extra care. But it was Rory's emotional healing that was most remarkable. In therapy, she began to process not just the sexual abuse, but years of psychological manipulation and control. She learned that none of it had been her fault, that she had been a child, victimized by someone who should have protected her. She began to separate her father's crimes from her own worth as a person. She also began to prepare for motherhood in her own unique way. She read books about child development, about breaking cycles of abuse, about raising children with love and respect. She wrote letters to her unborn child, explaining the circumstances of conception, but emphasizing that the baby was wanted and loved regardless. She chose a name, Hope, that represented not just her wishes for the child, but her own journey toward healing. The support from the community was overwhelming. Once news of Rory's story spread, people rallied around her. Donations poured in for medical expenses and future needs. Local organizations offered resources and assistance. Other survivors reached out with words of encouragement and understanding. Rory wasn't alone anymore. Dr. Finch remained involved in her care, checking in regularly, even though she was now under the care of specialists. He had saved her life by refusing to look away, by choosing to act when it would have been easier to rationalize and ignore. Rory called him her guardian angel, though he insisted he had just done what any decent person would do. They both knew that wasn't true. Too many people had failed to see or act on the signs over the years. As Rory's due date approached, she faced it with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew the birth would be complicated, both medically and emotionally. The baby would likely need time in the NICU due to being small and potentially premature. Rory would need support to deal with any trauma responses triggered by the physical experience of childbirth. But she also faced it with hope. Every kick, every movement was no longer a reminder of her father's violence, but a sign of new life, fighting to exist despite everything. She had chosen to transform her trauma into love, to take the worst thing that had ever happened to her and create something beautiful from it. The baby was born at 36 weeks, small, but fighting. Hope weighed just 4 pounds, but her lungs were strong, and her heart, despite the earlier concerns, beat steadily. When the nurses placed her on Rory's chest for the first time, Rory cried tears of joy and sorrow and relief all mixed together. This tiny person was hers to protect, to love, to raise in the light after so much darkness. Looking at her daughter, Rory made promises. She promised that Hope would never know fear in her own home. She promised that Hope would have choices, would have a voice, would know that she was valued for more than obedience. She promised that the cycle of abuse ended here, with her, with this decision to choose love over hate, healing over perpetual victimhood. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rory would need years of therapy to fully process her trauma. She would need to finish her education while raising a child. She would need to learn how to trust again, how to form healthy relationships, how to navigate a world that had been closed off to her for so long. There would be hard days, days when the weight of everything would threaten to crush her, but she wouldn't face any of it alone. She had her mother, who had never stopped fighting for her. She had a medical team invested in her success. She had a community of supporters who saw her not as a victim but as a survivor. She had Dr. Finch, whose courage in acting on his instincts had saved both her and Hope. Most importantly, she had herself, her own strength, her own choices, her own determination to build a life worth living. As for Greg, he faced justice in the fullest sense. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Survivors from his past came forward to testify. The photographs, videos, and physical evidence from the house painted a picture of a predator who had operated with impunity for years. His defense attorney could do little but try to negotiate a plea deal, which the prosecution rejected. They wanted him to face every charge, every year of potential sentence. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, Greg showed no remorse. Even facing life in prison, he maintained that he had done nothing wrong, that society simply didn't understand the special bond between father and daughter. His delusions only reinforced the jury's decision. During sentencing, the judge made it clear that Greg represented the worst kind of predator, one who had violated the sacred trust between parent and child. The judge sentenced Greg to life in prison without the possibility of parole, consecutive sentences that ensured even if one conviction was somehow overturned, he would still die behind bars. As they led him away, Greg finally seemed to understand that his reign of terror was over. He would never hurt another child again. In prison, Greg found that even among criminals, there are lines that cannot be crossed. Child abusers, especially those who hurt their own children, face a particular kind of justice from fellow inmates. Greg would spend his remaining years in protective custody, isolated and despised, living in fear much as he had made Rory live. It was a fitting end for a monster who had masqueraded as a father. But this story isn't really about Greg and his punishment. It's about Rory and her incredible journey from victim to survivor to mother. It's about the courage it takes to break free from abuse, to speak truth even when you've been silenced for years. It's about the medical professionals like Dr. Finch who refuse to look away when something feels wrong, who choose to act even when it's difficult or dangerous. It's about the power of choice. For years, Rory had no choices. Every aspect of her life was controlled by her abuser, but when finally given the opportunity to decide for herself, she made a choice that many couldn't understand, but that was entirely her own. She chose to see her baby not as a reminder of trauma, but as a chance for redemption, not as a burden, but as a blessing wrested from the worst circumstances. Some would question her decision to keep the baby. Some would say she was too young, too traumatized, that it would be better to start fresh without this reminder of her abuse. But Rory understood something profound. Healing doesn't come from erasing the past, but from reclaiming it, transforming it, choosing to write a different ending to the story. Hope grew stronger every day in the NICU, defying the dire predictions made during those first ultrasounds. She was a fighter, just like her mother. When she was finally strong enough to go home, Rory carried her out of the hospital with a mixture of terror and joy. She was 15 years old, a mother, a survivor, facing a future that was uncertain, but finally her own to shape. The support system around them remained strong. Rory's mother had transformed her home into a sanctuary for both her daughter and granddaughter. She had taken time off work to be there full-time, understanding that Rory would need help not just with the baby, but with learning how to exist in a world she'd been cut off from. Together, they created routines that felt safe and stable while still allowing room for the normal chaos that comes with a new baby. Rory returned to school through a special program for young mothers. It was overwhelming at first. She had missed years of normal socialization, didn't understand current slang or social media, felt like an alien among her peers. But slowly, carefully, she began to build connections. She found that her story, while extreme, resonated with others who had faced their own traumas. She wasn't as alone as she had felt. She excelled academically, driven by a determination to build a better life for Hope. Education became her pathway to independence, to ensuring she would never be dependent on anyone who might hurt her or her daughter. Her teachers, aware of her circumstances, provided extra support and flexibility. They saw in her not a cautionary tale but an inspiration, someone who refused to let circumstances define her limitations. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, Rory watched for any signs of the trauma that had marked her conception. But Hope was a joyful child, quick to laugh, eager to explore, showering everyone around her with affection. She looked nothing like Greg. She had Rory's eyes, her grandmother's nose, a smile that was entirely her own. In her, Rory saw not her abuser but herself, the childhood that had been stolen, now given a second chance. There were difficult moments, of course, times when Hope would make a face or gesture that reminded Rory of Greg, nights when nightmares would leave Rory shaking, afraid to touch her own daughter, therapy sessions where she would rail against the unfairness of it all, the childhood lost, the innocence stolen. But these moments became less frequent over time, overwhelmed by moments of pure joy, Hope's first word, her first steps, the first time she said, "I love you, Mama." Rory also became an advocate for other survivors. She spoke at events about recognizing signs of abuse, about the importance of believing children when they try to communicate distress. She worked with legislators to strengthen laws protecting minors from family abuse. She shared her story not for sympathy, but to shine a light on the shadows where predators like Greg operate. If her story could save even one child from what she experienced, it would be worth the pain of telling it. Dr. Finch remained a part of their lives, a reminder that there are good people in the world who will stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. He became like a grandfather to Hope, someone who had been there from the very beginning of her existence, who had fought for her right to exist and thrive. At Hope's first birthday party, he was there with tears in his eyes, marveling at how far they had all come. The party was small, but joyful. Rory's mother, a few close friends from her support group, Dr. Finch and his wife, and the therapist who had walked with Rory through her darkest moments, as they sang Happy Birthday and watched Hope smash her tiny fists into the cake, laughing with pure delight. It was impossible not to see the miracle in this moment. This child, conceived in violence and horror, was surrounded by love and joy. Rory had written a letter to Hope for this day, to be read when she was older. In it, she explained the circumstances of Hope's conception in age-appropriate terms. She emphasized that while Hope's biological father had done terrible things, Hope herself was not defined by his actions. She was defined by the love that surrounded her, by the choice her mother had made to see her as a blessing, not a curse. She was defined by her own actions, her own choices, her own beautiful spirit that shone despite everything. The letter also contained a promise that Hope would always know the truth, delivered with love and care as she was old enough to understand it. There would be no secrets, no shame, no hidden history to discover traumatically later. Hope would know her story, all of it, and would understand that she was chosen, wanted, loved fiercely by a mother who had every reason to choose differently, but didn't. As the years passed, this promise was kept. Hope grew up knowing she was special, that her mother had fought for her before she was even born. She knew there were difficult parts to her story, but they were always framed within the larger narrative of survival, strength, and love. When kids at school made comments about her not having a father, she would simply say that not all families look the same, and hers was complete just as it was. Rory graduated high school with honors, then went on to college to study social work. She wanted to be for others what Dr. Finch and her therapists had been for her: a lifeline, a voice of support, someone who could recognize the signs and take action. She studied hard, balancing coursework with motherhood, often staying up late after Hope was asleep to complete assignments. Her professors were impressed by her insights, particularly in classes about trauma and family dynamics. She brought a perspective that couldn't be learned from textbooks. Her contributions to class discussions were thoughtful and nuanced, helping other students understand the complex realities of abuse and recovery. She wasn't just learning about social work. She was preparing to change the field with her lived experience. Hope thrived in school, showing no signs of the difficult start to her life. She was bright, creative, and empathetic beyond her years. She had her mother's strength and her grandmother's warmth. Teachers often commented on her kindness toward other children, especially those who seemed sad or alone. It was as if she had an innate understanding that everyone carried hidden struggles. When Hope was 7, old enough to understand more complex ideas, Rory sat her down for a more detailed conversation about her origins. She explained that sometimes adults hurt children and that her biological father was in prison for hurting Rory. She emphasized that this had nothing to do with Hope, that Hope was perfect and loved and had done nothing wrong simply by existing. Hope listened solemnly, then asked the question Rory had been dreading. "Do I have to be like him?" Rory pulled her daughter close and told her firmly that she was her own person, that she got to choose who she wanted to be. She reminded Hope of all the people who loved her, all the good she did in the world, all the joy she brought to everyone around her. Hope nodded, satisfied, and asked if they could have ice cream. The resilience of children never ceased to amaze Rory. As Rory entered her career as a social worker, she specialized in cases involving familial abuse. She had an uncanny ability to connect with children who had been through trauma, to recognize the signs that others might miss. She saved lives just as Dr. Finch had saved hers. She became known for her compassionate but thorough approach, never backing down when a child's safety was at stake. She also met someone, a fellow social worker named David, who understood her history and admired her strength. Their relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect. David was patient, understanding that trust didn't come easily to Rory. He also embraced Hope completely, becoming the father figure she had never had. When he proposed, he asked Hope's permission first, understanding that they were a package deal. Their wedding was small, but beautiful, held in the backyard of Rory's mother's house. Hope was the flower girl, beaming with pride as she walked down the aisle ahead of her mother. Dr. Finch walked Rory down the aisle, having become the father figure in her life that Greg had never been. As Rory and David exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other, there wasn't a dry eye in attendance. Life settled into a new rhythm. Rory and David worked together, both professionally and personally, to create a stable, loving home for Hope. They had more children together, giving Hope siblings she adored. Each pregnancy was a chance for Rory to reclaim the experience, to go through it with joy and anticipation, rather than fear and isolation. Hope grew into a remarkable young woman. She knew her full story by the time she was a teenager, understood the weight of it, but refused to let it define her. She became an advocate herself, speaking to other young people about breaking cycles of abuse, about the power of choice, about defining yourself by your actions rather than your origins. When Hope was 18, she received a letter. It was from Greg, written from prison. Rory had always known this day might come, had prepared for it with Hope's therapist. Together, they read the letter, which was full of self-pity and delusion, Greg still painting himself as a victim of circumstances. Hope read it once, then looked at her mother and said, "He's nothing to me. He's just a man in prison who made terrible choices. You're my family. You chose me when you didn't have to. That's what matters." They burned the letter together in the backyard, watching the smoke carry away the last attempt Greg would ever make to insert himself into their lives. Hope never responded, never acknowledged receipt. Greg would die in prison years later, alone and unmourned, while the lives he had tried to destroy flourished in spite of him. At Hope's college graduation, Rory sat in the audience with tears streaming down her face. Her daughter was graduating with a degree in medicine, inspired by Dr. Finch to help others in their darkest moments. As Hope walked across the stage, confident and radiant, Rory thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that terrifying night on the roof when she was 14, pregnant and terrified, to this moment of triumph and joy. Dr. Finch, now in his 70s, sat beside her. He squeezed her hand as Hope received her diploma. "You did this," he whispered. "You saved her by choosing to save yourself first." Rory nodded, understanding that the choice she had made all those years ago, to keep Hope, to see her as innocent, to break the cycle, had led to this moment. Hope went on to become a pediatrician, specializing in treating children who had experienced trauma. She understood on a deep level that children were resilient but needed support, that healing was possible, that love could overcome even the darkest beginnings. Her patients trusted her instinctively, sensing that she understood suffering in a way that went beyond textbook learning. She married a wonderful man who knew her entire story and loved her not despite it, but because of the strength it had given her. When they had children of their own, Hope felt the circle complete. These children would never know the fear their grandmother had known. They would grow up safe, loved, with all the choices in the world available to them. Rory became a director of a child advocacy center, shaping policy and training new social workers. She testified before Congress about the importance of believing children, about recognizing signs of abuse, about the long-term support survivors need. Her testimony helped pass legislation that provided better protection for minors and longer sentences for those who abuse positions of parental authority. She never forgot that her story began with someone choosing to see and act. Dr. Finch had noticed something was wrong and refused to ignore it. He had risked his professional reputation, potentially his safety, to save a girl he barely knew. That single act of courage had rippled outward, saving not just Rory but Hope and all the children both women would go on to help throughout their careers. The clinic where it all began became a training site for medical professionals learning to recognize signs of abuse. Dr. Finch, before his retirement, instituted protocols that made it easier for medical staff to separate potential victims from their abusers, to ask the hard questions, to act on their instincts. The examination room where Rory's ultrasound had revealed the truth became a symbol of vigilance and intervention. Sarah, the nurse who had first noticed something was wrong, went on to specialize in forensic nursing. She became an expert in documenting abuse, in providing the medical evidence needed to prosecute predators like Greg. She often thought of Rory, how that one night had changed the trajectory of so many lives. She kept a photo from Hope's medical school graduation on her desk, a reminder of why the work mattered. The house where the abuse had occurred was eventually torn down. The community couldn't bear the reminder of what had happened within those walls. In its place, they built a small park with a playground. Children played there now, their laughter replacing the silence that had once marked Rory's prison. It was a deliberate choice, transforming a place of horror into one of joy. Rory would sometimes drive by the park, watching children play while their parents watched protectively. She would think about the 14-year-old girl she had been, trapped and terrified, certain she would die in that house. She would think about the moment she had bitten her father's hand, choosing to fall rather than be controlled for one more second. That moment of desperate courage had changed everything. The ripple effects of that night continued to spread. Other survivors, inspired by Rory's public advocacy, came forward with their own stories. Greg's other victims, some now adults, finally felt safe enough to speak their truth. Each story told made it harder for predators to operate in shadows, made it more likely that the next child in danger would be seen and saved. Rory's mother, who had never forgiven herself for not seeing the signs earlier, became a support group leader for other parents whose children had been abused. She helped them work through the guilt, the anger, the sense of failure. She showed them that healing was possible, that families could be rebuilt, that love could overcome even the most terrible betrayals. David, Rory's husband, became an expert in treating male survivors of abuse, understanding that the stigma they faced required specialized support. He and Rory often worked together on cases, their combined expertise and personal understanding making them incredibly effective advocates for children in danger. Their other children grew up knowing Hope's story, understanding that families could be complicated, but that love was always a choice. They became advocates in their own ways, standing up to bullies, reporting concerning behavior, never assuming that someone else would handle it. They understood that everyone had a responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As Hope entered her 40s with teenage children of her own, she reflected on the legacy of that night when Dr. Finch had refused to look away. Hundreds of children had been saved because of the chain reaction his courage had started. Policies had changed, awareness had increased, and countless predators had been stopped before they could destroy more lives. She kept a photo of herself as a newborn on her desk, tiny, fragile, fighting for life, in the NICU. Next to it was a photo of her mother at 15, holding her with a mixture of terror and determination. And next to that was a photo of her own children, healthy and happy and free. 3 generations, each healthier than the last. Proof that cycles could be broken. Rory, now in her 60s, still worked in child advocacy, though in a more advisory role. She had written a book about her experience, donating all proceeds to organizations that supported abuse survivors. The book became required reading in many social work and medical programs, a first-hand account of how abuse operates and how intervention can save lives. She received letters regularly from people who had read her story and found the courage to seek help, to leave abusive situations, to report suspected abuse. Each letter was a reminder that pain could be transformed into purpose, that the worst experiences could become the foundation for helping others. On the 30th anniversary of that night at the clinic, a ceremony was held to honor Dr. Finch, who had passed away peacefully the year before. The medical center created the Dr. Alistair Finch Award for Medical Vigilance, given annually to healthcare providers who went above and beyond to protect vulnerable patients. Rory spoke at the ceremony, her voice strong and clear, as she described the man who had saved her life by simply refusing to ignore his instincts. Hope also spoke, representing the generation that existed because of Dr. Finch's courage. She talked about the hundreds of children she had treated, many of whom were abuse survivors. She explained how her very existence was a testament to the power of intervention, to the importance of acting when something seems wrong, even when it's easier to look away. The ceremony was attended by many of the children, now adults, who had been saved because of the protocols and awareness that stemmed from that night. Each had their own story of a teacher, doctor, neighbor, or friend who had noticed something wrong and acted. The room was full of survivors and their children, living proof that one person's courage could change the world. As Rory looked around the room, she thought about Greg, who had died in prison 5 years earlier. He had spent 25 years behind bars, never showing remorse, never acknowledging the harm he had caused. He had died alone, his death noted only in prison records and not mourned by anyone. It was a fitting end for someone who had caused so much pain. But Greg's legacy wasn't the pain he had caused. It was the strength that had risen from that pain. Every child saved because of increased awareness. Every survivor who found the courage to speak up. Every professional who learned to recognize the signs. They were all part of a legacy that Greg never intended to create. His evil had been transformed into a force for good that far exceeded the harm he had done. The story of that night at the clinic became a case study taught in medical schools across the country. Students learned about the subtle signs Dr. Finch had noticed, the controlling behavior, the girl's silence, the father's insistence on answering for her. They learned about the ethical obligations of medical professionals, the importance of trusting instincts, the procedures for handling suspected abuse. They also learned about Rory's courage in passing that note, about the drawing that had confirmed the unthinkable. They studied the medical complications of her pregnancy, the challenges of treating a traumatized teenager, the long-term support needed for recovery. But most importantly, they learned that intervention was possible, that they could be the difference between life and death for a child in danger. Hope established a foundation in Dr. Finch's name that provided funding for training programs, support services for survivors, and legal aid for protective parents fighting for custody. The foundation grew quickly, supported by donations from grateful families whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of that night 30 years ago. At the foundation's first major fundraiser, Rory was the keynote speaker. She stood before a room of hundreds, survivors, advocates, medical professionals, and supporters. She told the story one more time, but this time with the perspective of decades. She spoke about the choice she had made to keep hope, not to advocate for others to make the same choice, but to emphasize that having a choice at all had been the key to her healing. She talked about transformation, about taking the worst thing that could happen and using it as fuel for change. She challenged everyone in the room to be vigilant, to act on their instincts, to remember that children rarely have the words to describe their abuse, but always show signs to those willing to see. The Foundation's work expanded rapidly. They funded safe houses for teenagers escaping abuse, understanding that teens like Rory often fell through the cracks of systems designed for younger children or adult women. They created educational programs for schools, teaching children about body autonomy and safe adults they could trust. They lobbied for legislative changes that made it easier to protect children and harder for abusers to maintain custody. Hope's children, now young adults themselves, carried on the family tradition of advocacy. They understood their unique position as the grandchildren of a survivor, the product of a choice that many couldn't understand. They spoke to their generation about consent, about recognizing abuse, about the importance of believing survivors. They were living proof that trauma didn't have to define future generations. One of Hope's daughters became a lawyer specializing in prosecuting crimes against children. She had the same fierce determination as her grandmother, the same refusal to look away from difficult truths. In her first major case, prosecuting a father who had abused his daughter for years, she thought of Rory and found the strength to push through the horror to seek justice. Another became a teacher, trained to recognize the signs of abuse in her students. She created a classroom environment where children felt safe to speak, where they knew they would be believed. She caught several cases of abuse early, her vigilance saving children from years of suffering. Each time, she thought of how one observant adult had saved her grandmother and, by extension, given her the chance to exist. As Rory entered her 70s, she looked back on a life that had been shaped by trauma, but not defined by it. She had taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and transformed it into a lifetime of service. She had raised a daughter who became a healer, who had children who continued the work of protection and advocacy. She thought often of that 14-year-old girl on the examination table, terrified and pregnant, certain her life was over. If she could go back and tell that girl what lay ahead, the pain, yes, but also the joy, the love, the purpose, she would. But that girl had found the courage to act without knowing the outcome, had chosen hope without any guarantee it would work out. That was the real lesson of Rory's story. Not that everything would be okay. Many things would never be okay. Not that trauma could be erased. It couldn't. But that even in the darkest moments, there was the possibility of choice, of transformation, of taking back power from those who had stolen it. That a 14-year-old girl could make a decision that would ripple outward for generations, saving lives she would never know about. The final truth was this. Greg had thought he was in control that night on the roof. He had thought he could take Rory with him, destroy her as his final act of ownership. But Rory had chosen to fall, to risk everything for the chance at freedom. And in that choice, in that moment of desperate courage, she had won. She had saved herself, saved hope, and created a legacy of survival that would outlive Greg's evil by generations. And every child who grew up safe because someone noticed the signs, every survivor who found the courage to leave, every professional who acted on their instincts, they were all part of Rory's victory. They were proof that love was stronger than hate, that courage could overcome fear, that one person choosing to act could change the world. And in a quiet clinic in Santa Rosa, where a new generation of doctors learned to recognize the signs of abuse, a plaque hung in the examination room where it had all begun. It read simply, "In memory of Dr. Alistair Finch, who saw, who acted, who saved, and in honor of all who choose courage over comfort, who speak for those who cannot speak, who refuse to look away." The story that began with a doctor's panic during an ultrasound had become something so much larger, a testament to the power of human courage, the possibility of healing, and the truth that even in the darkest circumstances, there is always the possibility of choosing light. Rory had made that choice at 14, terrified and alone. Hope had been the result, and from that hope had come healing for countless others, a legacy of love that would continue long after the last person who remembered that night had passed on. This is the power of choosing to act, of refusing to be a bystander to suffering. One doctor's decision to investigate his concerns had saved not just one life, but generations of lives. One girl's courage in passing a note had broken years of silence. One mother's choice to see her baby as innocent had transformed trauma into triumph. These individual acts of bravery had woven together to create a net of protection for vulnerable children everywhere. And somewhere, in clinics and schools and homes across the country, other Dr. Finches were noticing signs, asking questions, refusing to look away. Other Rorys were finding the courage to reach out for help. Other hopes were being born into love despite their origins. The cycle of intervention and healing continued, each story adding to the legacy of that night when a doctor looked at an ultrasound screen and chose to panic, chose to act, chose to save a life that would go on to save so many others.